So, first of all, I've got to say, Manchester never fails to deliver. As you all know from the incredible Masdar building next door, it really is home to some of the technologies that have changed the world. It was actually home to one of the first computers ever to be put into commercial use and academic use, called the Manchester Baby, if you want to Google it, and materials like graphene. And it's also home to, I think, the rainiest part of England. And as a result, there's a lot of umbrella retailers. So if you haven't got one, don't worry, they're readily available. But I'm also proud it's now home to the incredible Kraken Technology Hub. And it's an absolute privilege and a pleasure to welcome so many of you here to be part of this exciting event. We've spoken a lot today about Mercury and the need, the really urgent need, to enable devices to work more flexibly and interoperably so that we can enable more and more consumers to benefit from the electrification revolution and to drive down costs as they do so, so that increasingly electric solutions, whether it be heating or transport or industrial use, can be the cheapest as well as the cleanest choice for households and businesses around the world. And this is a global mission. And so it's a huge pleasure to welcome my friend, Lawrence, who is one of the most influential people in electricity in the world. When my team, our company grew from nothing, we had to learn everything as we went. And when my team said, like, you know, Lawrence and Edison are like, you know, the biggest thing, I hear this so often. And then one day I went to one of your events. Yep. And it was like the Super Bowl of electricity. I mean, everyone was there. And so thank you for coming here.
Thanks for having me.
To join the conversation.
Yep.
We can't mention the US and clean energy without, first of all, thinking about the impact of the American election, where energy has been a topic. Can you give us a quick idea of whether we should be perhaps worried or optimistic, or indeed help us think through, you know, paths to deliver the solutions we talk about?
Yeah, I think what I always say, you know, predictions after election is always interesting because I spend a lot of my time outside of the U.S. from an international perspective. I always think about the external factors that could impact domestic issues, right? And so when people ask the question, what is the impact of the election? I say, well, we live in an interconnected world. And so it all depends on how the forces converge or how the forces sort of interact, and that will determine where we go. I mean, if you go back and see previous elections where people said, you know, the industry was going to go in one direction or the other, what is important is that the clean energy transition has continued irrespective of politics, right? So if you take EEI members, for example, they've made significant investments in the energy transition, clean energy, irrespective of whether you had a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. Which speaks to the totality of us all accepting the fact that the energy transition will continue. Now, you may have some, you know, bumps along the way, we've discussed before, but I think generally speaking, the general observation here is that the industry is going to keep moving forward. And the fact that I see my friend Ashad in the audience gives me hope that it will continue, because it's a global audience, it's a global industry, and we've got to keep looking at it that way.
It really is, and I think in those terms, you said you look at these external factors. I guess first of all, a lot of people are surprised when they hear that the state in the US with the highest proportion of renewable electricity is Texas.
Yes.
Right? Because it's cheap and they can build stuff. And I think you know, the growth of renewables, even during the last administration from the new President Trump, was really strong. Yeah. Driven by essentially economics. Yeah. Anything on that?
Yeah, I think, look, one of the things I say is that electrons are politically agnostic. So if there's anything you want to take from this conversation, take that quote home. Electrons do not care whether it's right, left, blue, red, doesn't matter. Electrons move to the path of least resistance. Basic physics 101. So if you think about what's happening in Texas or what's happening in other countries around the world, Look where you have path of least resistance. And where you have path of least resistance is where you see this influx of technology coming. So my message to people is, as I travel the world, is look at the barriers you might put in place, which becomes resistance, electricity 101. Lower the resistance, you see the influx, and you see that happen in Texas, you see that happening in other parts of the US, you see it happening in the UK, and Morocco. I was just in Morocco, you see it happening there as well. So it's the public policy that enables the technology to be deployed that we see happening.
Well, you just mentioned Morocco, and my spies tell me you spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I think you mean Bahrain as well. That's a part of the world that is typically more closely associated with oil and gas. What are you hearing there?
Look, Morocco is moving like a rocket when it comes to technology. I mean, they're putting in place power plants, solar plants in Morocco that will blow your mind away. They're looking at hydrogen now in Morocco, right? They're also looking at flexibility. They're looking at how to sort of balance their grid, the connection to Europe in that context as well. And the other thing Morocco is doing, which I think is very interesting, they are investing in the young people. So they're already looking at building the capacity who will be able to run those infrastructures in the future. So there's a lot of lessons to learn. I was at this MEDIS conference organized by under the patronage of the King. And one of the things someone said was, instead of talking about knowledge transfer from the developed world to the developing world, we're getting to a place where, because these countries can leapfrog barriers quicker, Morocco may be actually teaching Europe how to deal with hydrogen, because they don't have some of the same regulatory and policy constraints, right? So there are a lot of lessons to learn from the global south in the global north.
Honestly, I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. We saw it with things like mobile payments, where some countries in the global south kind of leapfrogged landlines, went straight to mobile, straight to smartphones, and created entire payment systems that were digital, like a decade, 15 years before, certainly before the US, and long before most European countries. You're saying we're seeing that right now in energy.
You're seeing it in energy, and you will keep seeing it, especially when it comes to dealing with things like, if you see population centers, right? Take Lagos, Nigeria, or take, South Africa, Cape Town. You could see those countries actually deploying, whether it's the cracking technology or other technologies, much quicker, because they have to find a way to balance the demand for electricity in those countries with the sort of limited supplies they may have. And that's where energy efficiency, using technology like cracking will help, right? But since I'm talking technology, let me come back and ask you a question. Because we're in the UK, Manchester, technology, you have some of the brightest scholars here, great universities. What can the world learn from the UK when it comes to its energy transition and the things you guys are doing here?
Yeah, so I think the UK made early decisions to invest in promising clean energy technologies, particularly in wind, especially offshore wind. And as a result, despite not being a massive country, I think it did have the highest amount of offshore wind in the world until China literally blew through those numbers. But I think we can learn that when you really commit to and invest in a technology, you can drive the cost down and down and down. The cost of offshore wind has plummeted through this investment. But I think what the world can also learn is that if you don't reform your markets, there's a high risk it puts bills up when it could be bringing them down. And so right now, I think the UK is beginning to have to wrestle its way to a system with a lot more price signals. Because you can't do flexibility without a price signal to optimize against. And so far this year, we've curtailed 6.6 terawatt hours of wind.
Wow.
All of that is clean, zero pollution electricity that we've just wasted. And so I think what the UK now needs to do is take the incredible technology we're working on here, and so many people in this room are working on around the world, and combine that with the best market thinking. And look, some countries have done it. Scandinavia uses regional pricing.
Yeah.
And as a result, Norway, northern Sweden have got the cheapest electricity in Europe, and they're attracting massive investment in all kinds of electricity industries, from clean steel right through to massive AI data centers. To give you an idea, by the way, a typical data center in the UK is 7 megawatts. TikTok have just committed to a 150 megawatt data center for AI in northern Norway. And I think the scale is huge. I think around the world, of course, what we're seeing with AI is any countries that have got very slow planning systems, slow to get grid connections, slow to build stuff, slow to kind of create a national model, are going to really struggle because they've built all their models. And then suddenly being told, right, I think Microsoft said that globally they've currently got 200 data centers. Yeah. And they're currently in the process of the next 300. So it's taken Microsoft 40 years to get to 200 data centers, and over the next couple of years they'll do 300. Yeah. That's the scale of change we're seeing.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm fascinated about, I want to hear your thoughts, is you said 7 terawatts or something in terms of the amount of. So how do you tell that flexibility story? I mean, how do you get the policymakers, the consumers to know that it's not about reliability alone? Reliability is important, but flexibility. How do we tell that flexibility story? How do you guys do that at Kraken?
I think that's something the UK has done really well. Okay. Right. So we had a really dynamic consumer-facing energy market. Okay. And relentlessly, what we found is, frankly, I mean, first of all, everyone's an environmentalist till it costs them 1 cent more. And then 95% of people choose what's right for them in the short term rather than what's right for the planet and indeed their own long-term aspirations. That means that the single thing to make flexibility work is about bringing people financial benefits. But what we've learned is, just like when you go in a supermarket, there are hundreds of ways of presenting offers. It can be 10% off, 20% off, 30% off, buy one, get one free, buy two, get one free, 100 milliliters extra. It goes on. And people react to all these different offers in different ways. Obviously, one of the most important offers is food that is priced to clear before it goes off. Now, not everyone buys that. If I go shopping, I'm not a creative cook. So if I go shopping for sausages, I'm buying sausages. But my mum is a bargain hunter and a creative cook. If she goes shopping for sausages and she sees that, I don't know, cheese is cheap, she will literally change her cooking for that evening. Now, we've always assumed in electricity that people won't change their plans, and we're just wrong. Octopus has got around 4 million customers in the UK with a working smart meter. More than 2 million of them have flexed their electricity use in some way to benefit. Now, that can be they've got an EV that charges intelligently overnight, 7 times cheaper than a petrol car. But it can also be that if they live near a wind farm and it's windy, they use electricity at the windy times. By the way, that also means we had 30 this kind of flexibility. It aren't just that we use electricity more wisely, it's that more people want it. And then even like this weekend, actually, there was a storm in the UK. So electricity prices went very low, even negative. So we invited customers to use extra electricity on Sunday for 2 hours. Collectively, I think they used 730 megawatts, megawatt hours in those 2 hours. So it's the equivalent of all of the power in Manchester. Wow. And they just used that over and above their normal because it was cheap and windy. So I think what we found is the world of EVs, of heat pumps, of wind farms, of solar, and by the way, also like, interconnectors, everything, create these opportunities for consumers. But if we keep on throwing the wind away rather than giving the opportunity, I think the big risk is you get a backlash. Right now, people are beginning to say, like, is it really, is the renewable transition really worth it? Because it's putting our bills up. But the only reason it's putting them up is we haven't got enough flexibility and we haven't got enough price signals.
One of the things you mentioned flexibility a couple of years ago, many, many years ago, when I was doing my PhD thesis, I had this very strange idea that everything that moves has a value. So if you look at the grid, for example, you have transformers that move, but those transformers are not compensated for the movements, right? You have, HVDC, the controls. All these controls that move have a way to generate value. The problem is, how do you put a value on the movements of these devices? And that's something I would love to see at some point. Octopus will start saying not just customers, but even devices. Because if the device is moving, there's value that device is generating for the grid. So asset value in terms of every time it moves up and down, it's creating value, right?
We've seen something really cool in the US, actually. You might know more about this. But companies that are beginning to electrify school buses.
Yes.
And the cleverest companies that are doing that are not electrifying a depot. they're working out where to put a depot. Because actually, if you site the depot at the right locations, those school buses are sitting 20 hours a day just being optimized against price signals. And in the very smartest places, it's incredibly lucrative and makes those school buses so much cheaper than petrol and diesel ones. And certainly like the ones I want my kids to be in.
Yeah. So Greg, I want to move. I've been traveling, you've been traveling. You were just in China not too long ago.
Yeah.
Tell me what that did to you. What's going to China? What did it do to your view of where the world is going when it comes to technology and the transition?
You know, it was visceral. 6 or 7 years ago, if you're in Beijing or Shanghai, people wore face masks, not because of COVID, but because of air pollution. It's gone. In fact, I hate to say it, Lawrence, but not long after I was in those cities, I flew to New York. And honestly, New York felt like it felt like a lower income country. It's certainly in terms of things like the air quality. Like I walked around New York and you had these huge gas guzzlers idling in traffic compared to the, I don't know, 20 or 30% of the cars in some cities in China, maybe more, 40%, had the green number plate. They were electric. All of the buses in some of the cities, nearly all of the taxis, all of the two-wheel vehicles have gone electric. And I think the graph that should terrify every Western policymaker is the graph of electrification of end use. So if you haven't seen it, Google it. But it shows that end use of energy in the UK, Europe, and the US is about 20 to 25% of all energy use. And it's been broadly static for a decade. In China, it's grown from 10% of energy use to 33%, and is accelerating. And that's not happening because China is seeing, of course, there are plenty of people that will care about climate change and certainly about air pollution. But it's because electricity is the cheapest way to power industry. And they're locking in decades of cheap power now with the phenomenal amount of renewable they're building. 60%, 59% of all the renewables in the world last year were built in China. Their state oil company is already talking now about the death of petrol stations before 2040, right? That's the pace that is happening. And I think, while here we kind of spend endless time debating, they've kind of got on with it. The last thing I'd say that isn't obvious is there's a Western assumption that this is all driven by subsidies and by low wages. But for example, I went to the factory of one very large company, and the lowest wage in that factory was $1,400 a month. Now, that's not quite the standards of a lot of Western countries, but actually, there are plenty of European countries that are not a lot more than that. And it's not subsidies. I mean, these companies are competing like mad, but they're doing it on the basis of research and development. Every company we met spent between 7% and 11% of revenue on research and development. One of them had 100,000 employees in R&D, of whom, by the way, 8,000 work in clean power. I think 8,000 in one company is probably more than the entirety of Europe have working in clean power R&D. So I think what we need to understand is there's an exponential powerhouse growing, and you can't barrier your way out of it. If we try and protect our world from it, the gap's only going to get bigger.
Yeah. So in terms of that, when you think of innovation, right, that's something you guys do at Octopus here and at Kraken. So long-term thinking, right? You talk about the planning, looking out into the future, right? What do you think we need to do in Europe, in the UK, and other OECD countries in terms of going back to being able to think long-term? Because I think you've said it before, having that vision is extremely important, but then being consistent and persistent in staying on target, right? How do we do that in
I think collectively we need to educate policymakers that consumers love this if it drives down their cost of living and gives them better solutions. Electric car, everyone in this room knows this. An electric car is not a compromise, it's an upgrade. Too many of our politicians are hearing the opposite message from the Western companies that have failed to grab this opportunity and are instead trying to prolong the life of decaying technologies. By the way, those Western companies haven't done it because it's not necessarily that they're kind of cynically doing it. Culturally, they don't necessarily understand the different technologies and the way people use them, the way we do. It's a bit like if we asked the newspaper industry to create the internet, we'd still have those printers at home where you print a button, it all comes out on paper. Because they didn't realize that when you change the technology, you change the experience.
Yeah.
But I'd ask you, like, I mean, because especially in the USA, like, what are the conversations you have with utilities about, public support in this arena, and often the politicization of it?
Yeah. No, I think what we're seeing here is the trend is clear. More and more utilities are looking at deploying technology. I think getting the policy right is important, and there you're beginning to see different states doing things to accelerate the deployment of clean technology. You talk about data centers, for example. You talk about AI. I mean, these are areas where the utilities are now working very much hand in hand with some of the developers to make sure that there is some, sort of a overlap in terms of where things are going. I think the other thing we're hearing more now from the utilities, and we've seen it actually, is the willingness to embrace technology faster, right? Because one of the challenges this industry, and I'm glad you're doing this with EPRI, is that how to get innovation, not just to scale it up, but also to deploy faster, right? And so I think you've seen the hesitancy maybe 20 years ago is going away now, where more and more people say, hey, you know what? Let's embrace the technology and let's get the regulators on board, because that's the main part. How do you get the regulators to understand that this is valuable for customers, right? This is extremely important for customers.
Exactly. By the way, I don't know whether everyone knows this, but there are basically two totally different worlds of electricity or energy. You've got Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and a few pockets around the world where consumers choose an energy company, and regulators are basically there to stop energy companies misbehaving, or whatever. Not that we would, to be clear. But the second thing is, in the US and other huge parts of the world, Canada, South America, essentially the regulator defines the service that customers will get, and then energy companies deliver it.
Yeah.
And so in that model, regulators are actually have somehow got to become the leading innovators, or is that right?
No, you're right. I mean, you got to have that regulatory innovation, right? It's not just because we're in an industry where you need policy, you need technology, you need investments, right? So I always say you need innovation across the board. So if you have innovative policy ideas, the regulators will listen to you, but they have to make sure that those ideas have also the right financial incentives around it to make it work. So it's not just having innovative technology, you also need to have innovative regulation, innovative policy, but then you also have to be prepared to have startups that will come into the ecosystem and play part of that role, because you can't just rely on the utilities. They got to keep the lights on. So they need partnerships, and that's where it becomes important, right? Whether it's EPRI, Octopus, and EEI, we need partnership, because the utilities, their number one job is to keep the lights on. Yeah. So you need someone else to be helping to sort of push innovation and push technology in the sector, and that's where these partnerships become extremely important.
That's great. And by the way, while we talk about the US, we did start with the election. There is one thing on the election which is one of the greatest global champions of electrification. By the way, obviously many other facets to his character, in the founder of Tesla, Elon, is also part of the US administration. Is that going to help drive electrification? Is it good that there's, put aside everything else, just on electrification? Is there anything there?
I mean, right now the biggest driver for electrification that we're seeing now in the US is data centers, right? Now, the challenge with EV is not whether the people want it or not. The question is cost, right? Whether it's affordable, people are going to buy it, right? And I think you said at one point regarding BYD and all these other companies, you see the price going down. So we'll see, like I said at the beginning, in terms of prediction, I think we should just, like I always said, take a chill pill and just wait and see what happens, because it may go one way or the other way, we just don't know, right? And I think speculating on how it might go will be a sort of a fool's errand, but I do believe that electrification is unstoppable. Yeah. It's not going back, it's going forward. Now, the IEA came up with a report not too long ago, globally speaking, going back to where I spend most of my time, the biggest driver for electrification in the world, not just the US, the whole world, you look at the IEA statistics, is cooling and manufacturing. Now, talking about the low-hanging fruit we have in the world, which is extremely important, think about how much hotter the world is going to get and the demand for cooling systems, refrigerator for food, air conditioners. India, Europe, Africa. So I see the lowest, not call it low, the sleeping giant here is cooling. And I think you guys are doing some work on heat pumps and other things there, but we need cooling that is affordable. Otherwise, we're going to see a lot of people die in the next 10, 15 years if we don't address the cooling issue. And I think that's a big demand we're going to see coming, not just AI. I think AI is a good thing for the developed world, but I think the developing world, the number one priority now, lighting and cooling. Very important.
It's so helpful to get that global perspective, right? Although I should say on EVs, I think the latest UK sales figures are out today. 25% of all cars sold in the UK in November were EVs. That's ahead of the government's mandate of 22%, and 54% up on last year. In many countries, this cat's out of the bag.
And think what happens, Greg, when you go from EVs to e-scooters. Right? So you got billions of people in the world who cannot afford an EV, but they can afford an e-scooter. So if you think of what is Africa, Latin America, China, India, you name it, that's another potential market that's coming there. It's smaller, but that's what you guys do. When you aggregate 1,000 scooters, all of a sudden you got a demand there that you can use, right?
Honestly, if you live in a low-income country and you've got no electricity, 1 or 2 solar panels and a scooter with a battery that you can do the tiniest version of vehicle to home and use some lights at night, it's transformative. Absolutely transformative. Look, I'm conscious, I actually don't know how long we were given, but there's all these people here who never get to meet you and occasionally have to hear me on Twitter or something. Has anyone got any questions for either Lawrence or me?
Question.
And don't be shy. All right, be shy then. It's like an auction. You always need one person to start it off.
Going one, going two. You get to shake my hand if you have a question. It's a very good hand. If I put $100 in my hand.
Exactly, we'll pick on some. Jordan, you must have a question.
1 second, I think he's bringing the mic.
Hello, nice to meet you. And it's a little bit of a random one, but it got me thinking earlier about the UK and the government, and with this public sort of approach to energy, making it more of a service. What are your thoughts around that about British, I forgot what they've called it, was it British Energy? Yeah, British Energy, and how they're wanting to make it more of a public service than private businesses. What are your thoughts particularly on that? And Greg, have you seen it anywhere else in the world, Lawrence?
So the UK has got, the government set up a thing called Great British Energy, which is going to get £8 billion of public money over the next 5 years to help accelerate the transition. And so far, they're still defining their mission, but it looks like what they'll do is co-invest alongside the private sector in some initiatives and also fund some things, innovations that otherwise wouldn't get off the ground. I'm really optimistic. So first of all, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I mean, it's pretty private. I was having a chat with the new chair, Jürgen, who is a great guy. And the first thing he asked me about was flexibility. And he said, how can GB Energy help accelerate flexibility in the UK? Because I think so many of the things we deal with in this sector are kind of chicken and egg. The wonderful people at the energy system operator need enough confidence to use flexibility, in fact, to put it right at the top of the list of tools. But in order to do that, we've got to get enough people doing it. To get enough people doing it, we've got to have them in the system. GB Energy could help pump prime that by funding it almost like a startup. So before it's at viable scale, they fund it, it'll grow to scale, and then it'll prove its own worth. So that's the kind of thing they could do really, really well. There are then technologies, for example, I don't know, like the tidal as an example, are the kind of thing that we all know makes sense, but it's really hard to do with purely private money. And actually it needs pump priming, even to be able to get, for example, the government departments to be able to decide whether or not they'd support it. So I think that kind of thing could be very helpful. It's also helpful just to have, if the government puts its own money co-invested with stuff, it ain't going to change the rules, so that stuff's no longer relevant. So it kind of gives investors confidence. You see that around the world.
So talking about public-private partnership, right? I get this question all the time. Which country should we look at for setting the trend? And I go to one country. I won't say the UK. It's not the US. I go to Denmark. And I bring up Denmark for one reason. About 30 years ago, when the Danish government said, we're going to be the world leader in wind. Since then, the Danish government, or Denmark, has had multiple governments of different stripes, but they never changed the public vision and the public policy. Talking about consistency, that's important because investors want consistency. So I think to the point where policymakers around the world in any country want to have this grand vision, what's important is there's national consensus to say that, okay, we're going to go down this path in the UK, we're going to have flexibility, so if you change government 2 years from now, 5 years from now, that long-term vision is what sends the right signals for policymakers. And that's what I think we need in terms of public-private partnership, consistency.
Cool. Thank you, Jordan. Any more questions? I mean, like an auction, it usually gets started with one. Yes, at the back. EV Nick. It's great to see all these, kind of British electricity celebrities here, by the way. You got Jordan from My Energy, EV Nick from YouTube.
So when you first started Octopus Energy, I remember that you did a platform against other utilities, and they all kind of laughed when you said you were going to get consumers interested in energy. Then you came out with tariffs like agile, intelligent, etc. But as we move away now from the first adopter stage and into mass market, how do you think consumers are going to react? How are you going to get them more involved into going into these adaptive tariffs and energy all around the world?
I think it's entirely our job as a sector. And by the way, I'd love your view on how this works in the US and elsewhere in the world. So, look, it's our job to be looking at the energy system and finding ways that if we optimize it, we can bring people better services and lower prices. And honestly, what we found is just relentlessly, if we spot an opportunity, like someone on our team came up with this idea recently of just on windy days, we do free electricity, right? And we tried it. And I think in the last one, 800,000 households did it. In a competitive market, I know that other rival companies are looking at this, and indeed companies in associated sectors are looking at this sort of thing, and obviously they want to be able to do it as well. So I think there's no part of me, it's not for everyone. Just like I mentioned earlier, my mum is a bargain hunter. And there's enough bargain hunters in supermarkets to help reduce food waste and to be able to try new products and then tell people how good they are in response to offers. But often policymakers will go, but Greg, not everyone wants to do this. I'm like, it doesn't matter. We just have to find enough people who do, and we'll set the price and the messaging and the technology accordingly. But we've only just begun. And it isn't just about consumers. Look, I talk a lot about things like locational pricing, that electricity should be cheap in Scotland when it's windy. If you think about that, that's not just about saying people in Scotland will use more electricity at those times. But it's also thinking that also means that it would make more sense to have solar panels in the southeast of England, or to build wind farms on more expensive land in the southeast, like maybe out in the Thames estuary. It changes those investment decisions for households and for businesses. And it even means like when Microsoft are thinking about where to set up a data center, or indeed anyone else, they might put it in Scotland, or a bunch of them might get together and build their own interconnector from Scotland down to Slough and have their own green, cheap electricity in Slough. But they'd be reacting to price signals. And I think what would happen with electric cars? Well, it would mean vehicle to grid became far more valuable in areas with constrained supply, which means more people will buy electric cars because they'd be driving for free. They might get paid for it. So we are literally only just beginning a phenomenal revolution, but it's one that will be, different. It'll appeal to different people in different ways. And if you still want to buy electricity just by signing up for an annual tariff and it's totally flat, you'll be able to. It's just it'll be cheaper because the system's more efficient.
And by the way, building on what you just said, Greg, you said different choices by different people. Well, you're going to have also different choices by different states. You hear all the time, what's happening in the U.S.? Well, we got 50 states, right? They all have their different constituencies. They're all different constructs, different parts of the country. They all have different local resources, right? So you see that diversity of ideas that's being used to sort of spur, the direction. The good thing is everyone is headed in the same direction, but I always say, the energy transition is global in scale, but it's local in context and character. So every country, every state will have a different approach to it, and we shouldn't want everybody to do the same thing because we want diversity of ideas. And I think that's where, coming back to your question about, the differences there. In the US, East Coast, West Coast, in the middle, different set of resources, no one size fits all. And that's why I love my job, because when I travel around the world, every country talk about the energy transition, but from their perspective. One point I will make, I was in a meeting in Morocco, and we're talking about net zero. And this minister from Africa said, Lawrence, net zero for my country is going from 0 to 1, because I have nothing. My country is in the dark. So when you come and tell me net zero in my country in Africa, don't tell me to go from this to that. Tell me that you will help me to go from nothing to something. Now that's an interesting observation, because for them, getting from nothing to something is the transition they have to do. Whereas in the UK, you're going from plenty to flexibility, so you can sort of, let things vary depending on, the time of day or the time of the season or whatever, right? So I think having that universality of ideas in terms of how we go forward in net zero, the energy transition is extremely important.
Just to pick up on that point about the countries that currently got zero. There are about 800 million people in the world that don't have access to electricity. And there are plenty of countries that are agonizing over this kind of topic because, there's an entirely reasonable argument that says they've done nothing, literally nothing, to contribute to climate change. They suffer the downsides, by the way. And why shouldn't they benefit from, for example, oil and gas? Because we have, it's their turn, and we should sort out our energy system. And that's a powerful argument that currently does the rounds at all kinds of international events. But I think the magic of the kind of thinking and discovery we're talking about here helps you unlock a far better solution. There's a global sort of minimum standard which says a global minimum access to electricity should be 1 megawatt hour per year. Now, the electricity price on a typical grid in, for example, Africa is about 25 cents a unit. So that 1 megawatt hour would cost $250. So when we try to raise finance for an energy transition, we're trying to fund a grid that costs $250 a year to deliver that minimum amount. Well, the same amount of electricity is delivered by about 1.5 solar panels. That is a capital cost of $60 one-off. So if you have a couple of solar panels that last 5 years, you can meet the needs, that 1 megawatt hour need, for 5 years for $60 versus $1,250 via the grid. Now, what we need to do is help unlock this thinking. Because, of course, people say, but it's not 24/7. It's like, currently, you've got 800 million people with nothing. Right? And once you've got power, just like you worked out how to use a mobile phone to pay for stuff, you start working out how you can, for example, get a small battery or use a tiny two-wheel electric vehicle to have power overnight. It unlocks growth, health, education, everything if we do this. And it's literally 20 times cheaper to do it in a decentralized way than the old-fashioned way. By the way, most policymakers have not yet got their head around this. And then back to that idea about, look, this is a global scale transition, but it's done locally, right? I think I was speaking to someone from a very senior person in the UK energy system about flexibility. And in that wonderfully patronizing way that they used to use when we started building this company, he went, Greg, this is about big stuff. And I said, I'm not being funny, but the big stuff is just the sum of all the little things added together. The only reason you exist to do your big stuff is we've got all of this demand at the end of it. And if we make changes, often quite significant changes at that end, all the big stuff has to change. And there's a real risk that those policymakers that don't understand this are kind of doing the equivalent of building shopping centers just as shopping is going online. And I think what we can take out of this building is that message to all of them that this isn't, I still hear them say, in the future, your electric car will charge when it's cheap. I'm like, fucking hell. Sorry. I'm so sorry. I've survived the whole of today without swearing. Goodness me. You know, in the UK alone,
You know, Greg, I'm not going to cut you off. I was told my twin boys are watching this show, so be careful.
I've never heard Lawrence swear. So to your boys, your dad is a better man than me. And I'm very sorry.
No, it's okay.
Anyway, so I was going to say, but like, you know, just Octopus, just in the UK, just while EVs are only 5% of the market, and just while we don't even have enough price signals, you already have like nearly 1.5 gigawatts of absolute flexibility, which is the same as 1.5 nuclear power stations, which, by the way, in the UK, I'm not opposed to nuclear. It just takes us a long time, costs a fortune, is quite controversial. So I guess the point really is, what we're doing here is the exact process of acting on a small scale, but it sums up to that entire global transition.
I think he's standing, we might be ending soon, but I have a big question for you, a big one. So you talk about public policy.
Yeah.
And talk about how we move from silo policy making and start doing holistic policy making. And I bring this up because I think there's an opportunity that these providers of infrastructure in the future will probably look at an integrated utility that provides flexibility for water consumption, for lighting, and all these different services. And that means you need to have a holistic policy framework, not just one for water, one for energy, one for transportation. What's your vision on how we could create this sort of a holistic policy framework for how we deal with infrastructure going forward?
People who work in policy are nearly always really, really good people.
Yes.
Right? They've chosen to devote their life, their career, to something that matters. And they've often done that when they could have taken better paying jobs or more glamorous ones elsewhere. So I think that the challenge they always face is the extreme focus and criticism whenever they get something wrong. And that creates a real risk aversion in innovation. So I kind of think what it needs is leaders, whether that be, you know, I'm proud of what we've done as Octopus and Kraken, but device makers, so many, you know, everything from the leading innovators in electric vehicles or in cooling, or in batteries, in solar, in EV chargers. It needs all of us to be thinking about our role in this totally holistically, and then sharing the data back with them. Now, look, I started my career, my proper career, at Procter & Gamble, where everything we did had confidential written across it, all of our IP, everything we tested was secret. It kills me to work in a sector where every time we do an experiment that creates IP on consumer behavior, on optimization technology, we have to share it with policymakers, and usually with the rest of the world, in order to drive policy change. But we have done that. Not only have we done it directly, and you know, you only have to look at our social media to see how many times we've published the statistics on this. But for example, we've started something called the Centre for Net Zero, absolutely arm's length, not for profit, but they get access to all of our data. And in fact, when we do marketing exercises, for example, we'll be inviting customers to take part in a flexibility program. Centre for Net Zero can ask us to include control legs or test samples, so they get academic quality data and the kind of data that the public officials can rely upon in policy making. In fact, they've now taken all of Octopus Energy's smart meter data and used AI to create a simulation model that enables any policymaker to be able to say, what would consumer reactions be to a wide variety of price signals, device types in different energy scenarios, and open sourced it so that we can help policymakers make good decisions. So I think what we've got to do, what we've got a responsibility to do, is to share far more than we normally would, so that the world changes faster, and then we just have to bet on ourselves to win in that game. But ultimately, in this sector, unlike almost any other, I actually think that's the winning strategy.
You started by asking me a question about the future.
Yeah.
Let's end with me asking you a question about the future. Prediction, 2030. Where do you see Kraken? Where do you see flexibility by the year 2030 in terms of adoption around the world? Where do you see it?
We've all seen Jurassic Park, right? Honestly, nature will find a way. Right, in the long run, the quest for better value and better products always wins. We're already seeing, like, already this DNA has escaped. It's multiplying like mad. By 2030, I think it will be perfectly normal. But the secret to, and it will be good for all of us, but we do have to relax a little bit when we're all trying to guard, everyone's trying to divide the pie to get their value share. And in doing so, they're just making the pie smaller. We've got to go out and make a massive pie, and then we'll use the 2030s to work out who gets what.
That was my last question for you.
Now, in that case, I think we've got a hoverer.
I'm trying to hover. But, so, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Can everyone just give a round of applause for Greg and Dr. Jones, please?